Got my timer. Thank you so very much. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank the art education area, Dr. Kim Kosher, Dr. Laura Traffy-Pratz, Dr. Kundu, Dr. Woywood, and Elizabeth Rex for honoring me by inviting me here to speak with you tonight. Thank you very much for having me here. Christine spoke about my work, and actually I consider myself first to be a painter, and my story actually starts with my search as a painter. And so I'm going to speak to you a little bit about my work first before talking about my experience working with Maya artists, Maya painters, two Maya painters from Guatemala. And what I wanted to just start with is, I know, predominantly I'm speaking with undergraduates, and when I was your age, I was in art school, and what I found for myself was, at that time, which is very different from this time, with an interdisciplinary focus and kind of conceptual framework completely different. But for me, at that time, I really didn't find too much of a space for myself at the foundations level to predominantly skills-based classes. And I was sort of an autodidact. I was a kind of self-taught painter. And so I left art school with my art in my heart, but really seeking, I don't know what I was really seeking. And I went to Columbia and I studied anthropology and art history, as Christine mentioned. And then after I graduated, I traveled to South America, and I was really looking for a mentoring model for the study of painting. And while there, I was living in Ecuador, and I really encountered Bolivia, Peru, Chile, the Altiplano, where I traveled extensively and saw a lot of communities that had what I would call artistic living traditions, which meant that people were making art in their daily lives as opposed to sort of being in a formal classroom setting. And that really interested me. So I wanted to give you that background because the work that I later did and the work that I have sort of pursued with Maya painters started at your age, started as a kind of a quest at your age. And so what I'm going to talk about as a painter and an anthropologist and an educator is this collaborative mentorship that I experienced as a student with two Guatemalan Maya artists, Pedro Rafael Gonzalez Chavajay from San Pedro La Laguna, and Paula Nicho Cumez from San Juan de Comalapa in Guatemala. But before I do that, I'm just going to quickly take you through some of my work. And I'm a painter. I'm a painter who works from kind of an autobiographical, personal narrative. My paintings are sort of stories. These are some recent works. I have this dog, Augie, that I've had for 6 years, and I've sort of been dog obsessed, and he's been a part of my everyday kind of life, and I've seen him sort of as almost a guide. And so these works were kind of in celebration of him, but I was also looking at, I'm somebody who lived in Greece as a child, and kind of looking at the Greek side of my family, and thinking about the kind of sad things that happened as my father came to this country and sort of lost touch with his home country. And a lot of this work has to do with my childhood and kind of the story of, divorce when you are an only child, and thinking about looking back in some ways. So my work is always somehow this expression of working through kind of personal issues in my own life. These are oil paintings. They're about 6 feet, 5 by 6, 6 by 7 feet. I work very large. And this was actually, they're all stories. It was, it's called On a Walk with Augie and Bella, and it was myself and the two dogs and my best friend, and we were taking a walk. So when I talk about my work, it's always based in kind of a storied narrative. Again, these are kind of paintings that I've made in this series. It's called Augie and Kryssi Transposed, and it's a huge painting. I often start with text on the canvas, and then I use thin terps, and I read into the images, and then I create sort of these narratives. And what I tend to do when I get frustrated is I'll sort of turn the painting over. So I'm making canvases where this is actually the same canvas, and there's sort of the image of the person and the dog. And I don't know about you, but when I'm making my work, sometimes there's like a level of frustration, and then I sort of handle that by just switching things around a bit. So some of these paintings start off as one layer, and then they are covered again and again, and sometimes there will be, something like 10 paintings on one canvas, 10 images that I've painted over. I'm also Nichiren Buddhist, and so I've started to paint work that deals with some kind of Buddhist parables. I've been Buddhist for about 30 years, and so I did this series that kind of begins with a series of texts related to the idea that each person is an enlightened being. And this is a parable that kind of talks about, it's called the Dragon King's Daughter, and she's somebody who's sort of supposedly isn't capable of enlightenment. So a lot of my work is about human potential. These are, again, paintings that are a kind of Buddhist parable, discarding the transient and revealing the true. And this also is a painting that I turned over, so it becomes actually the scene where somebody was going to be beheaded, and then this big orb comes down. And so a lot of this work is, I start with just a narrative theme, and I make the work. This is a series that goes like sort of around a room, and I'm working on it now. It's called the Treasure Tower, and it's going to be a series of kind of creatures and humans, and as you walk in, you become part of this sort of grouping. And I like to work in diptychs and triptychs and work up the wall and sides. These are, again, like 6 feet by 6 feet. So I'm somebody who does not work small. I've never really worked small. And I don't sketch. I don't really follow a system for working that was something that I encountered in my classes. And so in a sense, it was hard for me, the idea of sketching to make a painting. I found like sketching to be something that wasn't really that exciting to me, because I felt once I had drawn it, and then I didn't. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there was a whole system in place that I didn't really find too much room in as a female painter who was sort of narrative based. And I feel like it's not a criticism at all, but because of our system, which is pretty much dominated and has been for historically in Western European teaching, a kind of male-dominated system, I started looking toward the way women work as researchers and the way women work, and I started reading about these kind of ebbs and flows that weren't necessarily a part of a traditional model for sketching and painting and doing exercises and rendering from observation. I'm not saying that's not great, it just wasn't something that I could relate to. So again, these are large paintings based on Buddhist narratives, and I set them up in my studio. I take images of them to see how they'll look on the wall. And this is, 10 feet. Actually, it's more like 12 feet, so it just goes up the wall, and it's just large. And then again, I was interested in the idea of how many thoughts and ideas and kind of the idea of the past, the present, and the future all in one person's head and life. and how many things go on at once. So I started this big head series, and so this was a painting that went in this direction, but then it was part of this big kind of monstrous head series, and I'm always sort of thinking about how many things are going on, which you can kind of see in my work. And these are some prints. These are etchings. Again, these are etchings on copper, and I tend to work very automatically. I, again, don't make sketches. I'll do a hard ground, and I'll just start drawing in, and then I'll start reading into that, and then the stories emerge. I have like an idea first, but it's never going to look the way I think it is. It never has, and it never will, which was disappointing to me. You know, in sort of art school, I felt that this is supposed to look how I imagine it to look, and it never did. So that was another issue that was like, I'm not somehow fitting in with what an artist is supposed to do. And this was, again, like a triptych series, and these are 24 by 36 plates. So, you know, ideas of love and relationship and disappointment and longing and history and sadness and animals. And then this was called Sailor Girl. A lot of my work deals with the fact that my father was a Greek immigrant, came here like when he was 30. My mother was Russian Jewish, and lots of stories about people traveling to get away from things and people changing their names. So, for example, my name here is Kryssi Staikidis, but I grew up as Kryssi Stack because my father had changed his name from Staikidis to Stack, and my mother had changed her name from Bronstein to Brown. And lots of like little stories of immigrants and shame and all of this stuff you kind of grow up with and you sort of keep in those little compartments. And somehow my artwork enabled me to just let it out. So this is called Sailor Girl, and you know, there are the stories of taking boats from Greece and disconnection with one's family and reconnection. And this is the same piece turned on its side. And this is about probably, I don't know, it's big. It's a big plate. Again, it's kind of an automatic drawing. And it's called Girlhood, and it sort of talks about what it was like to be an adolescent girl. So that's some of my work. And I, as I said, as this artist who was sort of seeking a space for myself, was enamored when I was living in South America with the idea of making art in a context of a studio, and teaching and learning in that context, removed from, let's say, a formal classroom setting. And what I was thinking about as well was that finding spaces that might be other than a Western or European model, based on my own experience of having seen people in predominantly indigenous communities working and living simultaneously so that the art might be part of an everyday life, such as weaving while, you know, in a garden with your family and children and cooking, and just the idea that art wasn't this separate event that had to take place in a classroom. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I just was seeking to see if there were other options because I didn't feel like it was giving me what I needed. So for my doctoral work, I got an MFA in painting, and I will say that if you see the way I talk about my work, it's not particularly formally. I could talk about the shape and the color and the composition and you know, all of the elements and principles of design, which I think are very important. But it was in graduate school at my MFA, I felt, you know, that was the only way people were really looking at this work or talking about this work. And I felt in some way, shape, or form rejected by that because there were these stories here that weren't really being allowed to come out in a class setting. Like in our crits, we would be, and this was a wonderful school, Hunter, but we would be in the back while the critique was going on and we could not speak. We weren't allowed to speak. And then people would speak, which was interesting. But there was no artist voice there to kind of support whatever was being said. So for my doctoral work, I went to study, I actually found contemporary indigenous a painting movement in Guatemala. And it had started in about the 20s or 30s in several different small towns. And I'm going to talk about Pedro Rafael Gonzalez's work, but at the time, and I'll just mention this, through the 70s through the 90s, there was a genocide of the Guatemalan Maya peoples. It was largely backed by the School of the Americas in the United States. But it was kind of presented as a civil war, and a lot of what came out when I went to study with the two Mayan painters was the trauma of that experience and the fact that there was really nowhere to talk about it because it wasn't safe to talk about, but it was a site of, reflection and resistance and protest was in painting. So you'll hear the artists talk about their work. So I can say that kind of selfishly, and this has been written about lots of times when cultural outsiders like myself go to look at or work with indigenous communities, there's this kind of idea of this, it's this, a sort of this distant but yearning or a feeling. Luke Eric Lassiter has written a lot as somebody who's worked with the Kiowa of wannabe. There's that wannabe, sort of you're going to go and you're going to find something, you're going to get something, and you're going to bring it back. Or, the whole sort of new age, there are lots of stereotypes about Native people. It's a long ago and far away idea that, indigenous perspectives are not contemporary. So one of the things that I had to do as a cultural outsider was to really reflect on how I was going to work with indigenous communities, because there's been such a historical trajectory of harming indigenous communities through both ethnography and anthropology. The idea of research from a distance where somebody's going to go in and look at somebody like they're an object, although you call them a subject. And then you go in and then you take away and it goes back to the academy, which is what I have attempted to avoid doing. But I have to qualify and say that, yes, what I am bringing here tonight is many years of work with an attempt to work with. That doesn't mean that in some way, shape, or form, I'm not part of this long trajectory, because I'm not a Maya person, and I'm speaking about Maya people with the Maya people not present. So that in and of itself is problematic. But this whole process has been this unraveling and kind of a self-examination as well. So I'm presenting this ethnography from that anthropological perspective of the long term, that the only real kind of work, and this is, by the way, Paula Nicho Kumez, one of the artists that I studied with, and this is her studio, and this is in the process of making a painting together. And so this idea of the collaborative as a lifelong practice is essential to a person like myself who is an outsider to indigenous communities, who approaches a community to work with as an attempt to understand something that's not part of my own conceptual framework. So this idea of the collaborative also means that anything that I write is translated and reviewed by the artists. Anything that I present is discussed with the artists. There's a connection that takes place over time, and that is a seeking approval of whatever it is I am going to be presenting. And so that's the idea of collaborative ethnography, that the writing is collaborative to some extent, that everything is reviewed and that there is an approval, a granting process. And in art education also, we've done lots of classroom ethnography where you look at the way kids work, or ethnography in higher education. But again, for the most part, it's been on sort of a shorter term. And this work is hoping to create pathways, which other people have as well created. There are ethnographers who have spent long time with the community, but this is what this work hopes to do, is to really take into account a lifelong commitment. In graduate school, a lot of what was being looked at and talked about was being looked at from a European model. So my wonderful advisor, Graham Sullivan, suggested that I go to Linda Tuai Smith, who's a Maori ethnographer who's wrote Decolonizing Methodologies. And it's a book that's for Indigenous ethnographers, but it's also for non-Indigenous people and how to work in a way that's going to be respectful with communities. And then Laurie Eldridge. And the reason I'm framing this work before I actually have the artist speak in this way is because I want you to know what's gone into thinking about this way this work was done. So, you know, in terms of Indigenous research, it's Laurie Eldridge, who's a Cherokee, she's an art educator, has really talked about the importance of knowledge being connected to the traditional ways of the people that are teaching, and then the idea that you're transformed along with the idea that somebody else might also be transformed along with you. You're transformed when I say, like, as the researcher. I mentioned this, the idea of the collaborative. So there, Paula and I are in her studio, and we're looking at a video of her, and she's giving me feedback at the top. And then, you know, Pedro Rafael is also interviewing me about, you know, my own life, as opposed to me just sort of being that kind of probing. And then the idea, too, is that he's teaching, he's guiding this work. And that was something Linda Tuai Smith talked about, that the Indigenous artist or the Indigenous person is the one who's teaching, not the one who's being studied. And then one other component is that all of this work comes out of the studio. So this is Pedro Rafael's studio, and these are drawings that I work from that are his. So the model is not a model of rendering from observation, which is a very different kind of experience than many of the ways that, even in K through 12, we've taught our kids to think about what art is and what it means. And, you know, again, I had to disrupt my own expectations because this was a kind of mimetic. I was imitating what he was doing. And in my own framework, that was something that was an apprenticeship model, but we've sort of disbanded in the European or American way. Apprenticeship models are no longer, unless it's, you know, in terms of painting, that wouldn't necessarily be the way that we're taught as progressive teachers to teach. So it was really important for me to look at my own biases. I've mentioned this, Linda Tuai Smith, but the idea of mentoring, so that my teachers mentored me, and that this adoption model, I lived with the families, and this is something that over 15 years I go back to study at least every few years. So now what I wanted to do was kind of introduce you to Pedro Rafael's work, and then some videos of him talking about his work, and same with Paula Nicho Kumez. I'm just going to pass through these, okay? These are two paintings. It's the same theme. Again, there's a narrative theme that Pedro Rafael starts with, and that theme is an original theme. So that means that he's come up with this theme for his work. And then he paints by sort of imagining what that would be on the canvas. So I'm going to now this is a video of him speaking about why he feels painting is important.
Bien, la importancia de tener alguna pintura.
Is that loud enough?
Como esta, es para dejar a los que vienen atrás, para no perder cómo empezó nuestra cultura, cómo era nuestra cultura. porque con el tiempo se va a perder todo. Ya ni la religión cristiana se va a aparecer, ni la religión entonces esto, dejarlo así plasmado en un lienzo, de ver cómo era nuestra cultura maya y cómo era nuestra religión. No es el cristianismo, porque era otro, y esto se fue perdiendo poco a poco. Eso es la razón de esto. Y si yo pinto también no es porque para adornar alguna pared, que para dejar algún mensaje. ¿Qué piensa la nueva generación de esto? ¿Qué conclusión tendrán esto? ¿Será que para hacer una comparación entre la vida actual y con la vida anterior, qué ventajas y desventajas hay con la tecnología? Y ahora tenemos ya cambiado todo lo que es nuestra cultura. Casi tenemos ya la cultura de otros países, que ya es una mezcla. Entonces esto ya se está quedando atrás. Para dar un ejemplo, nuestro traje ya se ve poco. Ya solo las mujeres usan el traje. Ya no es el traje auténtico también de antes, lo que es un traje que ya se está modernizando también en cuanto a las blusas y el corte.
So, I mean, he lives in a town where there's a lot of tourists and there's a lot of change. There are a lot of, drugs in the town. And if you notice in his paintings, all of the men and women are dressed in the traditional clothing. But you notice he was not wearing traditional clothing because a lot of the kids are no longer wearing the traditional clothing. But, as he was saying, this is, it's an issue in terms of maintaining culture. A lot of the children are losing the Tsutuhia language, for example. And so there's kind of a resurgence of a bilingual movement in the schools. But these are, the paintings become a place to kind of transmit and inform younger people about what sort of existed before. This painting was made in 1991. It's called Café, and it's obviously Maya people harvesting. But he's kept this theme going. This is now 2011, and this is something you could say, oh, well, tourists would probably want to buy these paintings, these kind of traditional paintings of these traditional ways that people perceive cultures from the outside. But Pedro Rafael really paints these to kind of talk about injustice.
Bueno, pero cambiando de esto, a esta pintura se le llama, el título de esta pintura es El Café. Pero aquí atrás de la pintura, aquí lo tengo atrás, aquí dice, nadie sabe por quién trabaja uno. Entonces yo no pongo este título enfrente porque acapara mucho lugar, lo pongo atrás. Lo puse así, nadie sabe por quién trabaja uno, porque nosotros, yo digo nosotros porque yo cuando tenía mis 12 años o 13 años, yo fui a la costa sur a cortar café. Y el trabajo es mucho y es muy poco dinero para uno. Entonces, y actualmente acá ya hay café. Nosotros escogemos el mejor café, cortamos el mejor café para exportar. Y lo poco que queda, que no es tan bueno, y dice, bueno, esta es la primera clase y esta hay que vender, y la segunda y la tercera clase es para nosotros. también nos paga mal, o nos pagan mal actualmente. Entonces, aquí nosotros trabajamos más en sembrar el café, limpiar el café, cortar el café y todo ese trabajo, y mandarlo. El mejor café lo tienen la gente de dinero y el peor café lo tenemos nosotros. Ahora, ¿cómo es posible eso? Por eso yo dije, nadie sabe por qué trabaja. Nosotros cortamos el mejor café, lo mandamos y no sabemos en qué institución, en qué oficina, en qué alguna casa o alguna familia de dinero llegan a tener el mejor café, mientras que nosotros, que somos el dueño, que nosotros lo cultivamos, lo sembramos, todo esto no lo podemos tener. Esa es la razón.
So yeah, and we consume that coffee. And you know, so lots of times the work in and of itself becomes a place to kind of a way to contest. This is such an amazingly beautiful painting. His color palette, I learned from him, he uses only specific colors and then he mixes all of those colors, so it's this consistent group of colors, but the colors that he gets, they are just amazingly rich. And you know, he was the first painter in his town. His grandfather was the very first painter in like the 1930s, and so he's really a very well-known painter, and all these young people come to study with him. Of course, I was a female and I was a cultural outsider, and there were no other females that he had ever taught, but he took me on as well because I was a painter. And so it was very wonderful because the teaching was such that all of his students would work on my canvases to correct. And it was just a whole new experience for me, that idea that you can actually collaborate on one painting, because my experience was sort of, it was going to be between me and the model, or me and the still life, or however it was me in my studio. There's that kind of stereotype of the individual. So this was a really different kind of experience. These were actually, and he sells his paintings and they're in collections, and when I was there last, he kind of went through all of these paintings with me. He saw my terrible video with the buses in the background, and that's what you're hearing because that's not my forte. But we put, you know, his son put a sheet behind it to make it look sort of, but anyhow, that was him talking to me. These are 3 paintings that he made because his grandfather, actually, who was 102, and the oldest, actually, as Pedro Rafael said, the oldest Catholic in the town, had told him about these cofradías, which were these like rituals, these sort of ceremonial parades that took place. And so he made these are these huge triptychs, actually listening to an elder telling him, and he visualized. And that's one of the things he talks about a lot, is working from the imagination. It is never that he's going to go and render something necessarily. He's going to visualize. So this, and he paints from like one direction on the canvas all the way down. He draws it out meticulously, and then he paints in one direction. So that's how he taught me as well. So these are these 3 paintings. And I'm going to have him just talk a little bit about how he works.
La forma de investigar es siempre haciendo una conversación con los más grandes. Por ejemplo, el que me ayudaba más cuando yo pintaba algunas costumbres de mi pueblo, entonces yo tengo que platicar antes platicaba con mis abuelos y todo esto, y siempre platicaba, y esto me lo grabé y todo esto, y lo tengo todo esto. Y cuando quiero hacer alguna obra de algunas costumbres acá, pues tengo también a algunos tíos que ahorita cuentan con 88 hasta 90 años, con ellos puedo consultar algunas, pero temas como este, que yo lo viví, no hay necesidad de preguntar, pero algunos temas como el tema que es la reverencia sobre la madre tierra, sí, esto casi no lo viví, pero sí mis abuelos siempre reverenciaban, dice, tengan cuidado, cuando vamos al bosque con mis tíos, y mis tíos me decían, tengan cuidado de no golpear a los árboles, de no golpear a las rocas, de no golpear a la tierra. Mire, este maíz, recógela porque es pecado. Aquí hay un grano de frijol, recogerla por favor. Entonces, hay una reverencia fuerte. Entonces, son partes de esto.
So, I just want to say this, is that I'm going to show this a little later, but I started this work with me videoing and then picking out what they said from interviews and presenting it in that way. But then I moved into how can this be that I am able to bring the artists' voices directly to the audience so that I'm not representing what they are thinking and feeling, potentially erroneously. So this is why I'm actually showing you the videos of Pedro Rafael and Paula speaking about their own work. Now, Pedro Rafael, as I said, I started to paint with him as the only female in that town, but when I started working with him, I thought about, well, are there women painters that I might study with? And at that point, I found out about Paula Nicho Cumes and went to San Juan de Comalapa. And this is Paula's painting, which differs. She's a female painter, and a lot of her work is imbued with a whole different kind of approach. So she started painting with her sisters. They started as weavers and then started painting. And actually, her husband was the first painting teacher of the women's Indigenous painting group. But this is her work, and I'm just going to take you through some of it. This is a painting entitled Mi Segunda Piel, and it's about the fact that when she was about 7 years old, there was going to be a parade, something like akin to a July 4th parade, and her mother spent months making her a beautiful kind of woven clothing. And when they got there, and Paula was about 7, second grade, the teacher, who was not Indigenous, said, okay, you can't march. All the Indigenous children will go to the side, and the children that have on, the uniform can march in the parade. So she never forgot that wound. And so she made this as a way to teach her daughter the importance of her traditional clothing and the kind of inseparability of her identity and this traje, which she calls my second skin. This painting, she said she had a dream about a woman flying, and that meant sort of the potential of her future. And this is a series as well. And she talks about how women make weavings, so therefore, as a woman painter, she always includes the weavings in her paintings, and lots of times from a distance when she looks at the mountains, what she sees are the weavings in her mind, so she incorporates those into her canvases. And this is her speaking about this work.
Esa obra se titula Nuestra Madre Tierra. Ahí miramos una mujer, lo tiene abrazado todo lo que es la humanidad. Y vemos allí árboles, flores, pájaros y el cielo. Y el cielo siendo que se mira el rayo, la energía del Dios de los cielos, refleja a la madre naturaleza. ¿Por qué madre naturaleza? Porque me refiero pues que nuestra planeta Tierra es como una madre, es como una mujer, le quiere toda a sus hijos, le da de todo, y yo siento que nuestra madre naturaleza, ese es el que nos da vida, nos da toda clase de vegetación, nos da toda clase lo que es lo que nosotros consumimos, pues los granos básicos, todo, y allí vemos en el corazón nace un manantial, porque sin el agua no hay vida, y también así sienten esos animales. Si no hay árboles, para ellos no hay vida. Y ahí hay un grupo de personas que están adorando a la madre naturaleza por pedir todo lo que ellos necesitan. Cuando amanece sentimos esa energía del sol, y primero pues lo que vamos a pensarlo en esa obra es un nuevo amanecer que nos da todo la energía, el poder y el calor. Cada día miramos, amanece y se pone noche, y nuestra madre naturaleza está muy contenta con nosotros, y así es una persona que tiene abrazado lo que es el pueblo. Ahí miramos casas de lejos también.
So, this is a painting that had to do with the genocide of the Maya, and it's called Shadows in the Soul, and it's speaking about a woman whose child was murdered during this time of what was called violence, and she's thinking about that time. And she has her nawal here, which is kind of the animal protective spirit. But so a lot of time was spent with Paula before she really talked about issues such as this. And it became very clear to me as well that the visual has an immense power to reveal in ways perhaps that people are not really comfortable talking about.
Ahí tengo otra obra que miramos una mujer volando. El título de esa obra es Cruzando Frontera. ¿Por qué cruzando frontera? Porque hay muchas personas que quieren ir en otro lado para ir a buscar la felicidad para su familia, y también decirlo de que van a buscar otra vida en otro lado, pero lastimosamente que muchas personas he visto a veces triunfan y a veces fracasan. Y vemos a ese perro que está llorando, está huyendo, porque así pasa pues cuando uno sale en su pueblo natal, más sentimos el dolor con nuestra familia, así nos deja y se va en otro lado, y así sienten los animales, porque el perro es amigo del hombre, y miramos ahí que quiere volar ese perro, pero no puede. Y así es el significado de esa obra. estoy pensando ahorita, todas esas personas han sufrido pues por ir a encontrar un buen trabajo, pero lamentablemente las personas que ahora no tienen libertad de quedarse en los Estados Unidos, no solo allí, sino que en diferentes partes del mundo, lo han regresado. O sea que para mí es una tristeza dejar familia aquí, dejar familia en otras naciones, y yo sé que es muy duro para la mujer y para el hombre.
See, these are, as we all know, because of the subsistence economy, people leave and they come here and then they don't have papers and then they're, we all know what is going on. And so the issues that are these contemporary issues that we're all dealing with right now are presented in these works. So I'm just going to quickly just go through this. The way that I've tried to change my work, as I mentioned before, as somebody who's been a cultural outsider working with my two Maya mentors, and just to say that I started with this work by doing photograph and text and talking about, as I have done in this presentation as well, really talking about the fact that mentoring involved dialogue and relationship, and that relationship was sort of the way that knowledge was transmitted. It wasn't just kind of instruction giving. It was relational, that I lived with people, I learned how to paint from and through that relationship, and that the teachers were also the students. So there was a kind of decentralized expertise model there. And so a lot of the mentoring was a two-way relational, and the studies were directed by my teachers, but they asked me, it was their culture, obviously. The content of the curriculum was their culture, but they asked me, what my color sense was, what I wanted to learn about. It was a learner-centered, and I guess as a painter, I was pretty enthralled with the idea of how do you teach? How does one learn, and how does one teach? So this is the way I kind of started talking about this work. And then I realized that these paintings were sites. They were places. They were places that, try to preserve culture, places that transmit culture. The way she's using these paintings is teaching me about her culture, and the weaving represents woman, and the red represents woman, and these are events that may not be taking place anymore. So there were these narratives which were really important to communicate, and that felt somewhat more familiar to me. And so, Paula talked about her work, and I presented her work in this way. Pedro Rafael talked about his work, and as I mentioned to you, I presented his work in this way. And then I began to write about what I was learning and what they were saying. This was a painting Pedro Rafael made about an event that happened where people were, you can see they were wounded, and then families came home. And he said Hitler was responsible for the genocide of the Jews. Well, what took place in Guatemala was the genocide of the Maya. They pitted us against our own people, recruiting us off the streets, kidnapping us, and making us fight a war against ourselves. These were the actions of the army and the dominant Ladino culture against the indigenous peoples. This didn't happen. He didn't talk to me about this the first summer. This was years in, when there was trust, because my country had done something to his country, and I was a representative of my country. So in that sense, that's what I mean by relational. And I know that all of us know that. We have mentors who we treasure as the people that have taught us, and we've had relationships with those people. So we all know this, but it really was clear to me that my actual learning was based on this kind of relational experience. then I started thinking about this work, like, okay, I'm talking about this work, the Maya painters aren't here, whose discourse is really privileged? And how am I talking about this work in the academy versus what happens in the community? You know, when we're sitting there in the rain together, when we're traveling on a motorcycle to go and look at the way people are dressed. A lot of the teaching took place really in a very active way. It was an interaction with culture and environment. So how do I represent that, you know, in the academy? And so I started thinking about, well, how could I work with trying to bring the artist directly to the audience?
Esta pintura se titula Abuela Ishmucané. Abuela Ishmucané es una diosa del tejido. ¿Y por qué? Por el serpiente que miramos aquí enrollado en su cabeza, que ese es el símbolo de diosa del tejido. Y a mí me gusta mucho hacer siempre con esos detalles de huipiles, y se parece a mi segunda piel. Aparecen libros ahí y me gustó leer una parte sobre diosa Ishmucané, y ahí dice de que ella es una abuela y que tiene muchos dones, hizo muchas cosas pues, y por ella aprendimos pues de generación en generación, aprendimos a tejer, y gracias a Dios que nuestro mamá nos enseñó el arte de tejer.
And then there were issues that came up, and you know, there's this idea that if you're going to do research, it needs to benefit the people that you're working with as well as the researcher. And in that sense, obviously, I have written about this work in the academy, and you know, that work has helped me to receive tenure in the academy, and so it's clear that I've benefited from this work, but how have the artists benefited from this work? And these are issues that always come up that often are very complex answers, because you're going to their space and in a sense, you know, you're learning from them, and then where does that go? How does that benefit them? So in certain ways, you know, there was always the effort to get grants to bring the artists here for the Smithsonian opening. They came here, and there were often trying to get exhibitions for the artists in California, New York, coming to universities, Madison, Pedro Rafael came. But there's also, for Pedro Rafael, he really asked me, he was ready to have this known about this painting that he made, about this genocide. And so he said, you know, please bring this back, raise the consciousness of people in the United States about what happened, so something like this will not happen again. And of course, you know, that is an ethical issue as well, because I happen to know that Efrain Rios Montt is still in the government in Guatemala. He was a tyrant. So how does that affect Pedro Rafael if Pedro Rafael is speaking about these very dangerous predicaments? So there's that idea, am I being paternalistic by saying, well, no, it's inappropriate, when Pedro Rafael is saying to me, I want this published. So there were all these different kinds of issues that one comes across. And one of the things that was really stunning to me is this idea that trauma testimony is, and this was beautifully put by Gambin, if speech is the key to reclaiming memory, and if speech is impossible, the challenge of collecting trauma testimony is to work in the cracks between the inside and the outside of language, between the sayable and the unsayable. That is, between a possibility and impossibility of speech. And I felt like these paintings were places where things could be said in ways that were completely transcended language. So this was a painting Pedro Rafael made called Masacre at Atitlan, and it was about 13 indigenous people being fired on by the army. in the town next to his. And he wasn't there, but he felt he must paint this so that people knew what happened. And so I have him talking a little bit about that.
Un día, el 3 de diciembre, sucedió una masacre en Santiago Atitlán y a mí me contaron esta masacre y me dolió mucho y sentí que esto se quedaba impune. Pero dije yo, esto no se va a quedar así. Mejor lo que voy a hacer como artista, voy a dejar algo para la nueva generación por el tiempo. Entonces pinté esto y tal como me contaron que el ejército había masacrado a 13 personas y a como 4 a 5 niños por una masacre de mucha gente en menos de una hora o en menos de 10 a 15 minutos. Son 13 vidas. Ya, tuve valor en decir esto. Y el valor también llegó a mi mente en decir, yo si me muero, me muero. Entonces dije, yo voy a hacer una pintura. Pero quiero empezar la pintura y quiero terminar. Pero ¿cómo lo voy a hacer? Aquí no se puede. Entonces, fue una casualidad que vino José, le conté, le planteé todo esto. Entonces dije, ¿lo vas a hacer? Sí, lo voy a hacer. Entonces, pero fuera de aquí. Entonces, es porque él me llevó a California. Entonces, ese era un valor. Porque si José me hubiera dicho, no, Pedro Rafael, a mí no me conviene. Mejor no. De todos modos, yo le hubiera dicho a José, pero si usted no quiere, yo busco otra manera. Tenía este valor ardiendo en mí. Yo tenía que sacar, pero tenía que sacar esa pintura, dejar hecho. Y si me matan después de esto, por ejemplo, ahorita todavía tengo el valor. Dije, bueno, si me matan, ¿quién me mata? Al menos esto ya no se puede borrar. Yo ya dije lo que tenía que decir, ya hice lo que tenía que hacer. Ya estoy satisfecho. Y he logrado lo que pensé y lo que...
So the idea that there's this painting is an urgent, it's urgent to make this painting.
Esa historia, Kryssi, a veces no a cualquier loco, sí, pero lo estoy contando ahorita y yo sé que se va a publicar porque sé de que es necesario decir la verdad. Es necesario escribir algo. Si yo ya lo saqué esto, se publicó a nivel ya de internet, esto ya lo sabe todo. Y creo que si me matan, para mí sería un éxito porque yo ya dije toda la verdad y me dieron tiempo para decir.
So in one sense, I'm saying that he wanted me to make this public, and in that sense, I was able to reciprocate because that is what I have tried to do for all these years, and it is something he wished. So that was the, trying to make this anonymous to the best of my ability, where you couldn't really see his face there. And so for the sake of time here, what I'm just going to do is quickly say that what I realized again in this work was that to present this work in connection with what actually happened, I needed to show us working together. So the last work I've done is really looking at us painting together.
Sí, pero ahorita vamos a...
What we see here is a time-lapse video of Pedro Rafael's and my many days of painting together on our canvas titled La Consolación. In our initial stages, through ongoing dialogue, I suggested a narrative theme having to do with our recent experience of a condolence ritual for Pedro Rafael's father-in-law. As I was living with his family and as his wife and I have become close friends, I was invited to participate in the Week of Grieving activities where townspeople came to pay their respects to her family. Because I have studied with Pedro Rafael for 13 years, coming up with a narrative theme was not a new process for me. The broader theme we came up with was serving others and sharing, and the theme for this particular painting would be consolation, a part of sharing and serving. Coming up with a narrative theme for a painting is part of the way that all Guatemalan Maya Pedrano painters work. Theme generation is thought to be the greatest challenge in the conception of a painting. After coming up with the theme, the first lesson involved brainstorming visuals as we began sketching directly on the canvas. This is what Pedro Rafael refers to as imagining the painting into being. In our painting process, the choice of color was representational in that it accurately reflected the colors of the traditional clothing worn by the Tzutu Maya of San Pedro La Laguna. Yet the choice of color is also intuitive in that the time of day and mood is captured by combining certain colors that Pedro Rafael repeats throughout all of his paintings to create a unique color palette that he alone is known for. Pedro Rafael considers paintings to be historical documents that retain and preserve cultural narratives and information for future generations. Pedro Rafael's pedagogical process involves giving me feedback at every turn, modeling painting techniques, color blending, and redrawing and repainting parts of the canvas according to his expertise. He considers direct correction on the canvas to be an essential part of teaching. New for me is collaboration between teacher and student on one canvas. Consulting with Pedro Rafael's other students was customary, and they too directly corrected the painting of newer students like me. This became a decentralization of the teacher as expert model as students began to teach each other in the style of the mentor. Relationship between teacher and student is at the center of the learning process as his other students and I shared family life on a daily basis, painting out of his studio in his home. Life and relationship are at the heart of his learning, which takes place with community at its center. A mentoring model guided by my Maya mentor, with his expertise driving the research, is simultaneously an Indigenous research methodology. Tehuai Smith 2012 recommends that all researchers, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, use protocols such as being respectful, showing and accepting respect, reciprocating respectful behaviors, and establishing long-term relationships that extend beyond a research relationship to one involving families and communities. And then lastly, Paula and I worked on a canvas.
Y el ajú lo podemos ubicar en este lado
con el sol.
Ajá. Y luego
No sé si el can tiene que ver con la noche,
vamos a leer
porque estaba como una noche estrellada en lo de Adelina.
dice que simboliza la fuerza del universo.
I'm just showing kind of our collaborative working, sketching together.
Ya en la tarde ya tengo, pues nos fuimos.
El día antes nos fuimos a la casa de Adelina, la hermana de Paula, y ella nos se compartió con nosotras el calendario maya.
Ajá, sobre el nahual.
Sobre Nahual. Entonces el día después pensaba, usted era que vino con la idea.
Las dos.
Las dos.
Ajá, porque me dijo que me gusta la idea.
Sí.
Que mi nahual es can y qué significa.
Sí.
Y allí fue cuando nos vino lluvias de ideas
Sí.
y mezclamos más nuestra libre imaginación a través de los glifos que miran de aquí. Pues así es la experiencia, tanto como usted y yo nos compartimos, y para mí pues que salió una obra bien linda y bien especial. Como lo dijimos hace días, que nunca lo he hecho yo también, solo he tenido en la mente que quiero hacer, pero para mi casa, no para venta.
So I think I'm going to stop there because this is but I have continued to study with Paula and Pedro Rafael, and I have been very influenced by the whole idea of collaboration and have continued to kind of participate with different people in painting portfolios, exchanges with Melanie Yazzie, who's a Navajo printmaker, as well as print portfolios. So that's just now working on a book to bring Indigenous art pedagogies and philosophies into kind of the mainstream for teaching and studying art. Thank you.